Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Koldar here. Today we are looking at the Council of Elders on normal difficulty in Throne of Thunder. And this is a fairly challenging encounter. There are 4 mobs, each with their own abilities, and it adds up to be a lot of stuff that's just going on all the time. So this fight is best described as hectic. That's really the best way to put it. But practice it a few times, kind of get used to the various mechanics, which ones are important versus those that you can sort of ignore a little bit, and then things will become a little bit easier after a while. So, since there are 4 council members, I think the easiest thing to do for this guide is to just walk through each one individually, talk about what they do, and then we'll go over the whole fight, together, and kind of how you'd want to order your DPS and target swaps and all that stuff. So let's get started. Now, the first mechanic to discuss is the Spirit of Gara'jal. So you may remember Gara'jal, the Spirit Binder from Mogoshan Vaults. Well, in spite of killing him, he has apparently returned in sort of an omnipresent spirit form, and he will possess random council members throughout this encounter, making your lives as raid members that much more difficult. So he's kind of a dick, basically. Now, his main mechanic here is when he possesses a random council member, that member starts to gain dark energy. So when possession begins, dark energy is at 0, and it goes up at a rate of 1.5 energy per second until it reaches the maximum of 100 energy. While energy is climbing up, nothing will happen. But once 100 energy is reached, the council member gains a new ability called Dark Power. Dark Power does 10,000 damage per second to the entire raid, shadow damage, and every second or every tick that it goes off, it increases the damage dealt by Dark Power by 10% per stack, and this can stack pretty much infinitely. So, obviously this means at the beginning you're going to take 10,000 damage per second to everyone. Then 10 seconds later, you'll be up to 20,000 damage per second. At 20 seconds in, you're at 30,000 and so on. So this adds up very quick, as you can imagine. So Dark Power sort of acts as a soft and rage mechanic in this encounter. You obviously cannot allow 100 energy to remain on a possessed council member for an excessive length of time, lest it get too high and just wipe your raid and AE damage. So you need to counter this by forcing the possession from Gara'jal to transfer to new council members throughout the fight. The way to do this is fairly simple. You must deal damage equal to 25% of the maximum health of a council member while they are possessed. So each council member has 90 million health. 25% is 22.5 million. So you have to do 22.5 million between the time they are first possessed and, when you want the possession to swap, when you want energy to reset. Now that said, you don't necessarily want to just force the possessions to swap as fast as possible. The reason for this is a second mechanic that has to do with energy swaps called Lingering Presence. Now, Lingering Presence is a debuff that the council members will gain when they lose an active possession from Gara'jal. So essentially, if one of the council members is possessed and your raid deals the necessary 25% of their max health and damage, when that possession is dropped, that council member gains a stack of Living Presence. Living Presence increases damage dealt by that council member by 10% for the remainder of the fight, as well as increases the dark energy gained, or the rate at which they gain dark energy, by 10%, and this is per stack. So since it requires 25% damage to break a possession, chances are the max stack you'll ever be able to see of Lingering Presence is 3 stacks, since they start with 0 and gain 1 every time you break a possession. However, because it increases the rate at dark energy is gained, this also means that the amount of time that you have when a target becomes possessed until that council member gains 100 energy and starts casting dark power is shorter and shorter each time they become possessed. So I mentioned the first time, you can see the numbers here, but the first time, or when they have 0 stacks, it's 1.5 energy a second, which gives you a little over 66 seconds, and this requires 337,000 DPS from the raid. At 1 stack, you're looking at 60 seconds or 375,000 DPS. 2 stacks is 405,000 DPS, and the final at 3 stacks is 438,000 DPS. So those are fairly low numbers, but there are a lot of other things going on in the fight that will require target swapping and damage wasted elsewhere, as well as tons of movement and whatnot. So as the fight progresses, getting those possessions broken before they reach 100 energy becomes more and more difficult. So that's just something to keep in mind. To that end, there's sort of a good idea, although not necessary, in that you can delay breaking the possession of a particular council member as long as possible, so that you can do extra damage to another council member and therefore basically not get an extra lingering presence stack or even multiple presence stacks that you would have had you just done the 25% to each possessed target and then had it swap. It's not necessary, and I'll talk about that later, but that's one way to go about it. So first, let's talk about Frost King Malakk. This guy seems to be the first possession target every time you start the fight. After his possession ends, the possession order seems random. It will just go through the other 3 remaining targets in a random order. It does not repeat until it has hit all 4 targets. But other than Malakk being first, everything else seems random. So anyway, Malakk is the main reason that you'll need 2 tanks for this encounter. He has a Frigid Assault ability, which he basically applies to his weapons and causes his melee attacks to deal heavy frost damage in addition to their normal physical hits. In addition, it will stack the Frigid Assault debuff as well. And if this debuff reaches 15 stacks, then the tank will be stunned for 15 seconds. And obviously that's bad. So you need to make sure that your tanks swap Frost King Malakk's target before any given tank can reach 15 stacks. His other main ability is Biting Cold, and this is cast every 30 seconds on a random ranged raid member. It does not seem to target melee or tanks. When this is active, it deals about 94,000 damage every 2 seconds to that targeted player, as well as any allies within 4 yards of the player. So the basic rule is if you get Biting Cold, stay a few yards away from everybody for that 30-second duration. Your healers will also want to make sure they have someone covering the damage on that targeted player. So just like all the council members, when Frost King Malakk gains the possession from Gara'jal, he will convert one of his existing abilities into a more powerful version. So in this case, while he's possessed, Frost King no longer casts Biting Cold, but instead he will cast Frostbite. Just like Biting Cold, this is cast every 30 seconds on a random ranged raid member. But the difference is that Frostbite does 22,000 damage per second to that target per stack of Frostbite. Frostbite always has 5 stacks when it is cast on you. So you're going to take 110,000 damage per second to that individual targeted player. However, if you look at our druid there, that's right in front of me, she's got Frostbite. So if you move into 4-yard or melee range of other players while you have Frostbite, for each player that you're within 4 yards of, the stacks of Frostbite are reduced by 2. This stack count cannot go below 1. So essentially what this means is if you are by yourself and you have 5 stacks, you'll take 110,000 damage per second. If you are near one other player, the stacks are reduced by 2 down to 3, but you're both getting hit by the damage since you're within 4 yards of each other. So this would mean 3 stacks at 22,000 is 66,000 damage per second to each player for a total of 132,000 damage per second. However, the way you really want to handle it is be next to at least 2 other players. So if you're next to 2 people with Frostbite, you're reducing the stacks twice for 4 total reduction down to 1 stack. And at 1 stack, you're taking 22,000 damage per second per player, and it's hitting 3 players. So a total of 66,000 damage per second. So from a healing perspective, the absolute worst thing you can do is be near only 1 other player with Frostbite. Better to be by yourself, as long as the healers can heal 110,000 on 1 player, or better yet, be near 2 other players. So there are a few ways to do this. One way we tried was to have Frostbite players stack up kind of in the center of the room with 2 other people at a given raid marker if it's clear. And this would allow them to only have to move for other abilities in the fight. So they could just basically stay stacked most of the time and not worry too much about it. The problem is that just like Frostbite, many of the other abilities from other council members prefer to target ranged players. Therefore, with 3 ranged players stacked up for Frostbite, you have a huge chance that one of them is going to be targeted by another ability, and means a lot of movement. And then while you're moving, chances are you're going to have 5 stacks since you're not within 4 yards of other people, and it's going to be a lot of damage. So instead, what we settled on is Frostbite players actually moving into melee range with the melee DPS and the tanks at the time, because melee are not targeted by most of the abilities, and therefore it's only, a 1 in 3 chance, approximately, that a range targeted ability will go in that melee clump. So just a little bit safer, generally speaking. Anyway, so that's Frost King Malakk. Basically, you've got the tank swaps, and then you've got the Biting Cold by yourself, but then when he's possessed, you have Frostbite instead of Biting Cold, so you need to stack up, preferably in the melee clump. Alright, so the second council member is Kazra'jin, and he's by far the most basic, simplest to deal with. He's the only one that doesn't really require a tank, or cannot be tanked, strictly speaking. He will simply run around the room by himself, charging at random raid members at all times. So you can see him, he'll line up towards someone, and then there'll be a sort of dark sort of goo on the ground to indicate his charge line. Then he'll charge toward that player, doing damage, electrifying the ground there for a brief period. Then he'll turn and charge another player and just repeat this over and over. So you don't need to worry about tanking him because that's all he does. So his basic ability, Reckless Charge, does pretty heavy nature damage to anyone it targets, about 90,000. So make sure you sidestep that. And then it will also knock you away if you get hit. In addition to that, Kazra'jin, when he's possessed, will use Overload. This is cast after he does a charge, and he basically becomes electrified, so he stuns himself for 20 seconds. So you can see him doing that right there in the top. But he also will reflect 25% of all damage taken back to the players. Or excuse me, 50% actually for normal difficulty. So he can kill you if you aren't careful and you hit him really hard during that period. Because of this, and because he moves around a lot, getting Kazra'jin down that 25% needed to push him through a possessed phase is by far the most time-consuming and difficult of the of the 4 council members. You will have to often stop DPS if you're low health, so that you don't kill yourself. And if he's running around, melee are going to have trouble staying in melee range at times when he charges. So all in all, he takes a long time to push compared to the other mobs. So just keep that in mind. But as I said, that's all he does. So luckily he's fairly simplistic in mechanics. So we've saved the worst for the last 2. Sul the Sandcrawler is probably the most challenging of the council members in terms of difficulty that he adds to the fight. number of mechanics and all that. So he will basically chain cast his main ability, which is a sand bolt attack. This is just a bolt cast at a random raid member, and it does about 165,000 nature damage to that player, as well as anyone else within 5 yards. So if you didn't have enough reason to try to spread out, there's another one. This can be interrupted, so it's a good idea to at least have your tank interrupt every time they can. And it would be ideal if you could also have another player interrupting as well. Preferably a ranged shaman or something like that. That doesn't have to be in melee range. But either way, try to interrupt that as much as possible, because the damage can get pretty spiky from everything that's going on, and you don't want those bolts to add to it. Now, the next ability is quicksand. You can see the pools of quicksand around the room. You've probably seen them from the ads in Horadon, so same basic idea. In this case, quicksand, it deals heavy damage to anyone standing in it, and it also will cast Ensnare on the player. So basically, Ensnare will reduce the movement speed of the target every second until they reach 5 stacks, at which point they become rooted permanently. So if you happen to be in it long enough to get 5 stacks and become rooted, you probably are going to die from the quicksand damage anyway, so that's bad. But that said, the Ensnare is a magic ability, so your healers, if they're quick, can dispel Ensnare stacks and just give players a reduction in movement slowing, so that they aren't in there for any length of time, basically. But generally speaking, your players just need to watch very closely for when that trap lands underneath them and start moving out of it immediately. Even a couple ticks of that are going to be 300,000 plus damage, and that combined with a random sand bolt or something else can easily kill you. So react quickly. That's the main thing. Other than that, when Sul becomes possessed, instead of quicksand, he gains sandstorm. Sandstorm is probably the most dangerous ability in terms of overall raid damage, and it basically deals heavy AE, about 38,000 damage per second to all players, for 8 seconds in total. And it also causes all the existing sand piles from quicksand to form into living sand, which are these little elemental ads. These ads should be killed immediately, because if they remain alive for too long, they basically get fully healed and increase the damage that they deal by 100%. So if you allow them to stay active for a while, they're going to just keep gaining stacks and do more and more damage and wipe your tanks in the raid subsequently. So if you get Sandstorm, make sure you AE heal like crazy. That's the time to use your raid cooldowns, and then gather up all the little guys and AE them down as quickly as you can. And that's pretty much it for Sul. He's, like I said, he's got a lot of stuff that does a lot of damage to the raid. Between the bolts, the things in the ground, and the sandstorm, you're going to have a lot of stuff to deal with. So if you could prioritize any one of these guys, I think Sul is probably the ideal. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit later. So last but not least, we have High Priestess Mar'li. And she doesn't do nearly as much damage as Sul, nor does she require tank swaps or anything like that. But she mechanically changes how you position for the fight the most. And the reason for this is one of her 2 basic abilities. So before I get to the positioning one, let's talk about her main attack, which is Wrath of the Loa. This is just a bolt attack, very similar to Sandbolt from Sul, and it should be interrupted every chance you can. So it does about 140,000 holy damage to the target, but obviously the more you can interrupt, the better. The reason it's not as dangerous as Sul's is because it doesn't have an AE component, so it simply hits the targeted player rather than the target player and people within 5 yards. So still, you should interrupt it as much as possible, but it will not be quite as much damage as Sandbolt. Now that said, the main ability from High Priestess is Blessed Loa Spirit. So when she is not possessed, she will summon a Loa Spirit, which is a tiny little creature that will spawn at her location and then move immediately to the location of the lowest health council member beside herself. So whichever council member happens to have the lowest health, that's the one. So right here you can see a spirit spawning in tiger form, kind of the right of Priestess. And it's trying to make its way over to Sul, who is the lowest health at the time. So if the lowest spirit reaches melee range of the targeted council member, it will heal that council member for 10% of their max health. In addition, if the spirit is left alive for 20 seconds, even if it hasn't reached melee range, it will just leap into melee range and heal them anyway. So you can't just infinitely, kite it or keep them separated that much or whatever. That said, the spirits are stunnable and rootable, and you can knock them back and all that good stuff. So you want to make sure they're slowed, make sure they have big duration stuns every time they spawn, get a rotation going if needed, but just try to keep them away from that targeted council member so that any heals that potentially are going to happen are prevented, because 10% health of a heal is pretty hefty. Now, when High Priestess becomes possessed, the Blessed Loa Spirit becomes a Shadowed Loa Spirit. So in this case, the mechanic is different. Rather than the spirit targeting a council member and trying to get in melee range to heal them, the Shadowed Loa Spirit targets a random ranged raid member and tries to get in melee range of that player. If a Shadowed Loa Spirit gets in range of you, it will instantly kill you. That's it. And the same rules apply. You can slow it, stun it, snare it, knock it back. And if you don't kill it within 20 seconds, it will jump onto the player anyway and kill them. So when High Priestess is possessed, make sure your raid members, especially your ranged players, are standing at max range so that if they happen to be fixated by the spirit, they can kite away from it a little bit while the other DPS kill it off. We did find that we have 2 melee DPS, and so obviously the remaining 4 are ranged DPS. And generally speaking, our melee DPS did not worry about attacking the spirits that spawn, since it's a lot of movement to get back and forth if they're not near her already. So if they're next to her, they obviously help, but if they're on the opposite side, they don't come over. So as long as you have snares and stuns, your ranged DPS should be able to finish them off. So with the mechanics of Mar'li out of the way, now you understand how she forces positioning, because her spirit will generally try to heal the lowest health council member. So you cannot have Mar'li tanked right next to the lowest health council member besides. Otherwise, it will just instantly heal that member. You can't kill the spirit in time. So this means that when tanks target swap, depending on the council member that you primarily focus, you may need to also swap Mar'li at the same time. So generally speaking, you have one tank that's the primary Sul tank, and you have one tank that's the primary Mar'li tank, and then you have Malakk switching back and forth as necessary, because he's the one that forces tank swaps. But if most of your DPS is on Frost King Malakk, when he is on the tank with Mar'li, then you cannot allow Mar'li to cast a spirit right next to him. So if Malakk is the lowest health besides Mar'li, when your Mar'li tank grabs Malakk, the Sul tank will have to grab Mar'li and just switch the boss's positions. On the other hand, if your primary DPS focuses on Sul, which is what we're doing here, and I'll explain that later, then you should not have to worry about Mar'li's position. You should simply only have to worry about swapping Frost King back and forth, because Mar'li will always be opposite the other lowest health target, which is Sul. So just something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, your lowest health target should not be Kazra'jin, because he's by far the least dangerous of any of them. So you don't really need to worry about killing him earlier than anything else. But just something to keep in mind. So basically, if you have Frost King as your lowest health, when he switches, you have to switch Mar'li as well. But otherwise, you don't have to switch Mar'li. So keep that in mind. So finally, as we switch back to the start, I want to talk about the general DPS order. And this is based on your comfort of your raid, how you want to handle things. But the way we are doing it here seemed to work out the best. So our basic plan was that early on, while the gains of dark energy are not very rapid, we could afford to reach 100 dark energy and spend some time with the dark power ticks going off before everything did more damage and whatnot. So when we start the fight, even though Frost King always gains the first possession, we use all our DPS cooldowns in Bloodlust and DPS on Sul as much as possible. This way, we're basically able to do about 50% damage to Sul before we have to actually swap to Frost King and push him, through his possession just like normal. So generally the timing worked out that around 60 to 65 energy on Frost King, about the time when he's swapped to the other tank that's on Sul anyway, we all swap our DPS to Frost King. So you can see Sul is a little bit below 50 there. And that's the basic idea here, is that from this point forward, any time we get to do extra DPS, we throw it on Sul, and that way, shortly after he becomes possessed, we should be able to kill him and eliminate all his abilities from the encounter. That's the basic goal, because as mentioned before, Sul is the most dangerous, in my opinion anyway. So getting him out of the fight means that even if you have to switch possessions very rapidly between the other dudes, the chance of dying is very low without sand traps and sandstorm and sand bolts and all that stuff. So once we start attacking Frost King, once he gets about 60 energy, then eventually we're going to get to 100, and the AE damage will start to climb up. So make sure you save raid cooldowns for that period if you copy this strategy. Once you push Frost King, the next possession will be random on anybody. In this case, it's Kazra'jin. So we switch to him immediately because Kazra'jin, as I mentioned before, generally takes longer than the others to push him, since you have to stop to reflect and he moves around a lot and all that stuff. So if Kazra'jin gains possession, we just immediately start attacking him to get him that 25% threshold. And so there he's pushed himself over. And now we'll pretty much just go in order, because we know that it's either going to be Sul or Mar'li next, and it doesn't matter so much which it is. Once it's Sul, we'll be able to push him nearly to dead in that one transition. And then from that point forward, just miscellaneous damage will eventually drop him down, and then we just have the 3 mobs left. So in this case, Priestess Mar'li is next. So not much special going on here. We're just staying away for targets for the shadowed lowest spirit. So there's the spirit there. And we're knocking it back and stunning it and all that good stuff. And then we just burn it down quickly and then get back on the priestess. So we probably could have actually waited until 20 or 30 energy on the priestess to engage her, because she only got up to about 67 or 68 there before we transitioned. So we could have done even more damage during that time to our primary target, which is Sul. Again, the idea being to transition as close to 100 energy as possible for that possessed target, so you can get extra damage on the other council members. Anyway, so now we're on Sul as the final possession in this round. And here you can see he used his big AE and then spawned all these little guys. So we're finishing those off. And then otherwise just focusing DPS on Sul as much as we can. And I think he's going to transition well before he gets to 100 energy as well, but not much we can do about that. We could arguably attack a different target for a little while, but we did not do so. So there he transitioned at 75. And so I think we're able to finish him off in short order here. Yeah, so there goes Sul. So that's the basic goal. That was our plan, was by the time he gets possessed, we're able to kill him shortly after. And now, with only 3 guys left, things are much easier. Even though possessions, as I said, will transfer more frequently to any given target, because you don't have the sand traps and ads and all that stuff to worry about, it's a lot easier to handle the damage and stuff. So I won't bother walking through the rest of this fight because luckily this is an encounter that the difficulty is all at the beginning, really. As it goes on and you get rid of some of the council members, things become easier and easier. So that's kind of a nice change from what is the norm. So anyway, that covers everything, I think. That is the Council of Elders. It's a pretty challenging fight, but just practice the mechanics of each individual boss, especially as they're possessed, and then eventually you can put it all together and get a kill. So good luck, and thanks for watching.